Peter Mason leads on public sector work for the digital engagement specialist Commonplace. He's a Bartlett-trained planner and a councillor in West London, where he was until recently a cabinet member for housing, planning and transformation. He also serves on the Old Oak Common Park Royal Development Corporation Planning Committee. So, Peter, the government's recently launched its consultation on planning reforms with the Planning for the Future white paper, and Commonplace has written a report entitled Engaging for the Future in Response, and that focuses specifically, as the title suggests, on the issue of engagement. So can you tell me what its main findings are?
So the report sets out a call for ongoing and transparent engagement. Much of the reforms that are set out in the planning white paper are really quite exciting. The digitisation of plan making, the focus on sort of place-based visions, whether at neighbourhood or at a council-wide scale, and underscoring the importance of involving people and public voices in that vision, but also engaging them in conversations about character of area. There are some elements that we think perhaps the focus may be in the wrong place, and perhaps that we can use the best of technology to really enhance even more so the intent, because there perhaps might be a risk that the government, through the reforms, could be undermining some of their own agenda around handing back control to local communities, but also finding consent for the levelling up agenda in certain communities. We pick up where Grosvenor left off in 2019 with the stats that I'm sure shocked the built environment sector at the time. 2% of developers and 7% of local authorities being trusted to make decisions in the built environment, sort of in the interests of the public. So we work with Public First, who've done a lot of work in this area with government, and using our own data for about 2.5 million conversations, as well as polling and focus groups. And actually some of the results that we got were really quite fascinating and sort of really supported some of our thinking in this area. Firstly, people want to participate in planning. 76% of people thought that they needed to be given a greater say over how new developments happen in their local area. People think that the whole system lacks transparency. 52% of people said that new developments were taken, or decisions about new developments were taken in secret to avoid a public backlash. That the current engagement mechanism for planning is low and negative. Only 27% of people said that they'd participated in a decision. And of that, 60% had petitioned to oppose development in their local area. And our data showed quite the reverse, that those who'd been previously engaged in a consultation or reading and interacting online were 5 times more likely to participate themselves. And so whilst the reforms perhaps seek to give greater certainty to developers and investors around a rules-based system, and sort of perhaps de-risking some of the discretionary elements of it, there's a risk that too much of that emphasis is going on plan making at the expense of implementing plans. And they're missing an opportunity to really use the best of technology to sort of use data to support that decision-making process. And we've also got some recommendations in there as well about how good engagement works overall, and sharing some of our experiences over the many years that we've been working in this space.
So can you tell me how Commonplace works in that space?
Yeah, so we really view engagement as a conversation, not a survey. It's a process, not an event in time. And perhaps we've become too accustomed in the planning world to our statements of community involvement and tabulating information and meetings, whereas actually there's a really interesting world of conversation out there to have with the public. And so we principally work in the built environment, mainly with councils, developers, planners, architects, sort of connecting people to the places that they love with the decision makers that influence them. And we've done that to date with around 250 customers, over 1,000 projects. And we've always viewed ourselves as a digital wrapper to great engagement. And actually, that's one of our main recommendations of the report, the notion that digital engagement should be plugged into an overarching strategy of engagement with communities. And certainly since lockdown, we've seen some of that happen quite rapidly and radically, as traditional face-to-face engagement has moved to sort of digital first. And we're now working with sort of 2/3 of London boroughs, major sort of county councils and the home counties, also in northern powerhouse locations and in Scotland. And we're seeing a sort of a rapid increase in the number of developers too, and their communication agencies and partners using Commonplace to really sort of get into the weeds of meaningful conversations with communities about the things that they're doing. Really comes three principles as a company. One is social proof, the notion of transparency. You know, you and I are having this really interesting conversation. If we would normally do this in public and we would have an audience that would be able to share their views, and everybody would be therefore be able to hear and come to understand each other's opinion. The second is about critical mass. We want to find audiences of people who will engage in conversations about meaningful change. And we're able to do that in locations where we've just done a significant number of projects. And the third one is, again, returning to that principle of ongoing, the notion that engagement is not just an event, it's not just a survey, it's a process and a mechanism through which people can learn and understand and converse and come to sort of the compromises that are necessary to be able to see change happen.
So how do you avoid hijacking of digital surveys by activist groups? I mean, that's an experience I've had quite recently around the survey of Hounslow town centres, where responses were patently reflecting just one social media grouping.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about working on over 1,000 projects is you come to learn an awful lot about what constitutes really great engagement and perhaps where there's room for improvement. And, you know, I can give you the technical answer, which is sort of Commonplace has, you know, built up its arsenal of tools to be able to defend against sort of what we call gaming. We've got verification and we monitor IP addresses. We do all of those things. I think perhaps the bigger, broader issue is the fact that in a social media age, debate and disagreement are going to happen, and they're going to happen on lots of different social media channels. And Commonplace is about channeling that energy into something more constructive and analytical. We get asked a lot why we don't have a sort of a thumbs down button on our engagement. We only have a thumbs up. And again, it comes from the principle of how our engagements work. It's really easy to simply disagree and to not share a view as to why you disagree. It's more meaningful and it's more constructive if your disagreement is proactive and you set out your stall. And we see that as part of a sort of a wider strategy that enables sort of decision makers, councils, developers to do really unique things with big data sets. And it's about sort of moving that conversation away from perhaps a traditional form of decision making, which is focused too much on deciding, presenting that decision, defending it to the public and implementing it, much more towards a model of asking people, identifying, co-creating with them and designing. And we see that with some of the greatest sort of engagements that we've got working through Commonplace, working with some really amazing councils and developers to sort of take that conversation live. Because ultimately people want to be listened to. They want to have grown-up conversations. And if you embed that into the way that you speak to them, then you'll get great results. So, you know, testing sentiment for change. You know, what do you like about your community? What do you dislike? You know, understanding the public sentiment towards that, and then testing change. You know, if your community is run down, if your community is too polluted, what would you like to see change? Providing options and alternatives. If you agree that things need to change, what kind of changes would you support? And then co-creation of the changes that you would support. Let's think about how they might be configured. Because I think too often change can, or the theory of change can oscillate between the notion of the Big Bang or nudge theory. And actually what we're about is giving decision makers lots of tools to gather data, to analyze it, and to really get into the bottom of community sentiment that ultimately flows into the decisions that they're making sort of in the public interest.
So you've suggested in the past that with the NPPF's presumption in favour of sustainable development and viability assessments trumping planning obligations, councils are less in control of planning now than any time since the nationalisation of planning rights in 1947. So, and there's also recently been some criticism that the new government proposals are rather anti-democratic, despite the digital engagement that it proposes. So can that engagement overcome issues, worries that people have? You know, will it help deliver local plans that truly involve communities in just 30 months, or even can it help design a local design code?
Well, I think it's useful perhaps to take a step back first to examine the sort of broader context of what's happening, I think, around us. And so much of our political discourse at the moment sort of seems to focus on left behind communities, the notion of the sort of the Rust Belt and the Red Wall. And that's a bit of a reflection of people feeling powerless, that they are in less control of the things that are impacting their lives. And at the same time, we've got sort of technology through social media connecting us together in sort of new and really interesting ways that Lewis Silkin would never have been able to imagine all the way back in 1947. And what that's doing is putting information and decisions at our fingertips in lots of different arenas. And it's also creating sort of new identities. You know, we are coming together through social media platforms in a way that hitherto we've not been able to do in sort of geographically located communities or locations. How do people see themselves? You know, are they, you know, do they define their identity in London by the tube stop that they sort of use? And how does sort of COVID impact that when we're not commuting? And public policy is complex. Decisions are complex. We have communication and transport that's connecting the world in really interesting ways. And that also means that labour and capital markets are complex and global too. And we see that in the built environment. You know, the role of direct foreign investment and property as a, you know, as an exportable asset, the decoupling of supply and demand in a place like London, where sort of people feel that the cost of living and house prices are sort of out of control. And when you focus back into the planning process and what planners are expected to do, so much of the sort of the politics of what the good society should look like or how the economy should work is being displaced into a planning process that was never really designed to be able to ask some of these or answer some of these sort of really, really huge questions. And so you end up with communities who do feel a sense of dislocation and disempoweredness, engaging in a physical process of change in the built environment that's incredibly tangible. You know, if you've sort of moved into a community and there's a 25-story tower being proposed next to you, it's a tangible change in a way that you're projecting your income in 10 years' time is not going to be. And so that sort of community identity and character of a neighborhood is up for grabs. And, you know, and communities aren't necessarily just defined by the built environment. They're defined by sort of their hopes and aspirations. And they're often disagree, you know, people have disagreement. You know, if we can't agree on some of the most basic things like the human condition, the state of nature, that's the size of government tax burden, then we're not going to be able to agree wholeheartedly on whether we should prefer sort of Georgian, London, stock brick, municipal 1950s brutalism, Pondbury's sort of neoclassicalism. What we can do is build platforms and mechanisms through which we can come together, engage meaningfully, and find those compromises that we discussed earlier. And sometimes that's possible on a really small scale. Community review panels, the way that local councils involve residents in estate regeneration groups, digital channels, and this is the big hope of how you use technology in the 21st century and you embed it in your decision making and your planning processes, helps you massively scale that conversation and to be able to engage people in their identity and in decision making that will ultimately, we feel, hopefully, get better results through that process of discussion, disagreement, compromise, yes, and the ultimate decision making.
Absolutely. Well, something at NNA we very much agree with. I mean, we see our role as informing people so that by being better informed, people can make better decisions. So, Peter, thank you very much for your insights and for telling us about the interaction that we hope will take place between communities and planners in the future.
Brilliant. It's been a great conversation. Thanks for having me.